Survivor, a game about winners and a game about losers. Millions of people around the world dream of playing and the majority of them have failed. But sometimes those people get a second chance at the greatest game on earth. This video is about those people. All-Stars. This video is about Survivor All-Stars. There is always the intense feeling from Survivor players if they played a good enough game to be asked back for a second opportunity at the greatest game on earth. Today we honor those people, or maybe dishonor them as we decide who is the best of the best in terms of Survivor two-time players. And the best part about this entire idea is, I didn't come up with these rankings, you did. I love getting the community involved and you all killed it with some polls reaching over 3,000 votes. We have done these tournament styles many times before, but if you are new here, these are intense, single knockout elimination games. Normally in Survivor All-Star rankings, we have players like Boston Rob and Sandra near the top. Well, yeah, of course, but not here as they have played the game way too many times. Fun fact, Bruce and Steven Fishback got kicked out in the very first round of our tournament. And a little bit of ground rules before we get started. There's 7 rounds total and it's single knockout elimination. This video is sponsored by Idle Plays. If you're a Survivor superfan with the dream of trying the challenges, Idle Plays has Replica, Survivor, puzzles, and games. You should go check them out, link in the description. Going into round 1, I saw one insanely close matchup. It was Lex versus Brenda, with the votes being 45% to 55% for the winner. And we also saw some players eliminated way too soon. I don't want to get ahead of myself, but I mean, it's tough for fans of RHAP with Steven Fishback. Ultimately, this is what ended up happening. Tai Trang versus Eric Reichenbach. Troyzan Robertson versus Courtney Yates. Steven Fishback versus Kim Spradlin Wolf. Xian Wang versus Bruce Perrell. Russell Swan versus PG Law. Lex Vanderberg versus Brenda Lowe. Going into round 2, I knew we were going to have more controversial matchups with John Cochran versus Yul Kwon, 2 fan favorite players, which actually brings up a really good point in what makes these single knockout elimination tournaments so brutal. Just based on the random seeding, we get players making it way farther than they probably should with Bobby John, and players getting eliminated way too soon like Terry Dietz. It's a trend throughout the entire video and the entire tournament, but there's gonna be many hot takes throughout the entire thing. The poll I was most excited for was Philip Shepard versus Tom Westman, and the community did not disappoint with how it went. We had one poll being such a widespread, the widest we've ever seen, with 96% to 4%. That was of course David Wright against Colton Cumby. That one was a landslide. And let's go roll the results. Abby Maria Gomez versus Michelle Bradshaw. Richard Hatch versus Zeke Smith. Johnny Fairplay versus Kimmy Kappenberg. Yao Man Chan versus Sharon Osko. Vias Bakauskis versus Sophie Clark. Debbie Warner versus Wendell Holland. Michelle Fitzgerald versus Caleb Reynolds. Andrew Savage versus Sugar Kuiper. Philip Shepard versus Tom Westman. Jervis Peterson versus Big Tom. Terry Dietz versus Rob Sesternino. Rudy Bosch versus Jenna Lewis. Kat Ederson versus Haley Ford. Nick Wilson versus Danny Boatwright. Randy Bailey versus Laura Moret. Ben Driebergen versus Monica Padilla. Amy Cusack versus Sue Hawk. Francesca Hoagie versus Jenna Maraska. Wu Huang versus Alicia Calloway. David Wright versus Colton Cumby. Bobby John versus Sierra Dawn Thomas. Denise Stapley versus Catherine Vabrick O'Brien. Monica Culpepper versus Brandon Hance. Adam Klein versus Corinne Kaplan. John Cochran versus Yul Kwon. Tasha Fox versus Natalie Anderson. Arish Bakauskis versus Tai Trang. Keith Nail versus Courtney Yates. Kelly Wigglesworth versus Kim Spradlin Wolf. Danielle DiLorenzo versus Xian Wang. Eliza Orlund versus PG Law. Dawn Meehan versus Lex Vanderberg. Round 3, we noticed there was a clear indication that some Survivor superfans were getting really pissed off with the results. I was pumped seeing Natalie finally eliminated after dominating every tournament we have ever done. I would like to say we saw super close polls, but the only close one was 44% to 56% with Tai Trang against Michaela Bradshaw. Obviously, most of the polls ended in a landslide, as many winners were representing the polls, like Yul, Kim, Michelle, and Denise all putting on dominating performances. Anyways, let's roll the results. Richard Hatch versus Johnny Fairplay. Yao Man Chan versus Sophie Clark. Wendell Holland versus Michelle Fitzgerald. Tom Westman versus Big Tom. Rudy Bosch versus Haley Ford. Laura Moret versus Ben Driebergen. Amy Cusack versus Jenna Maraska. Wu Wang versus David Wright. Denise Stapley versus Monica Culpepper. Yul Kwon versus Natalie Anderson. Tai Trang versus Michaela Bradshaw. Courtney Yates versus Andrew Savage. Kim Spradlin Wolf versus Rob Sestranino. Xian Wong versus Nick Wilson. Eliza Orleans versus Bobby John. Lex Vanderberg versus Adam Klein. We are now entering round 4 of the tournament. On one side of the bracket, you had winners like Nick, Ben, Jenna, Denise, Adam, and Yul all putting up a big fight. But on the other side of the bracket, it was a little bit less competitive, as we had Richard, Sophie, Michelle, Tom, and Kim all being the winner representatives. I was so sad to see one of them go, but it was fitting that our closest matchup was 42% to 58%. And it was Tai versus the first ever winner of Survivor with Richard Hatch. And let's roll the results of round 4. Sophie Clark versus Michelle Fitzgerald. Jenna Maraska versus David Wright. Tai Trang versus Richard Hatch. Courtney Yates versus Tom Westman. Kim Spradlin Wolf versus Rudy Bosch. Nick Wilson versus Ben Driebergen. Eliza Orleans versus Denise Stapley. Adam Klein versus Yul Kwon. Going into round 5, everyone was predicting that the Survivor winners would be clearing out the rest of the board. But it was tough to see because it meant we would lose the only non-winners remaining with Courtney Yates and David Wright. It was crazy to see how things work out, but we have now had the closest poll of the entire tournament, with Nick Wilson and David Wright having the winner won by only 1%. And here it is. Richard Hatch versus Michelle Fitzgerald. Courtney Yates versus Kim Spradlin Wolf. Nick Wilson versus David Wright. Denise Stapley versus Yul Kwon. Obviously, entering the semifinals, we were all hoping for close matchups and close battles, and that kinda happened. Obviously, it was going to be crazy close between Michelle and Kim. Hot take, but I think all of you voting got the result of that one wrong. But we had a little bit of a landslide with the other matchup being David against Yul, and we all knew how that one was going to end up. Michelle Fitzgerald versus Kim Spradlin Wolf. David Wright versus Yul Kwon. Going into the finals, the community agreed this was literally the perfect matchup we could have imagined for this tournament. This is by far the best way to end the 2-player tournament, and let me know in the comments down below who you would have preferred to win between Kim and Yul. And with it coming down to 56% versus 44%, Kim Spradlin Wolf versus Yul Kwon. Here's an overview of the entire tournament if you're curious. Anyways, make sure to click that red subscribe button down below as we're on the way to pass Russell Hantz. And click right here to go check out the First Boot Survivor Tournament.